All right, we're back for another solo episode. Sorry we've been gone for so long, but there's a lot of stuff going on at Zero, and we've finally managed to tee up a time to record a few of these. So expect a few more coming, and hopefully staying consistent to the best of our ability. We do have quite a few competitions and travel coming up, so I'm going to try and really create a stockpile of these episodes so they stay consistent and release more frequently. Today's topic I want to talk about is knee wraps, and this was suggested by a man named Sean Piercy from South Africa. So thank you, Sean. And if you're a sleeved lifter, do not leave the chat. It's valuable for you to listen to this. And the number one reason it's valuable is because if you know more about wrapped lifting, when you go to talk shit about wrap lifting, you're going to be so much better at it. So besides that, it's also, we're all in the same sport. It's good to know about what's going on, what the differences are. It's a good piece of information to be more well-rounded, especially if you end up coaching, you're going to get questions around what's the difference between this and that. And knowing how to navigate that is always a handy thing as well. So I feel like the best place to start this is debunking some myths. And a lot of these myths around wraps come from the old guard. 10, 15 years ago, there were really only a few factions in powerlifting. There were definitely multiple federations, but nowhere near as many now. And you kind of had tested, which was dominated by the IPF, and untested, which was mostly like equipped lifting and monolifts and knee wraps. Equipped lifting sort of started to phase out as raw lifting was introduced, which happened around that sort of 2010 range. I think IPF introduced raw in 2011 or 12. Before that, there was like certain invite meets around the place, Raw United, for example. And if you go way back in time in powerlifting, original powerlifting, raw was counted, or classic raw, as they call it, was counted as soft suit, knee wraps, belt, that kind of thing. That's why there's always that argument of like, what's raw? Raw is with knee wraps, because it used to be. Let's just call it sleeves and wraps. Both of them are raw, whatever. The details on that are not that important. What I'm saying is a lot of the myths come from that era where information wasn't great, and it was just a case of old law. Like you would just listen to the guy who listened to the guy who posted the article on the internet, and if it sounds good enough, you just kind of trust it. But some of these myths kind of traveled or stayed through when it comes to knee wrap. So a couple of these myths I want to debunk right off the bat. So first thing is the direction you wrap your knees. A lot of people will say wrap your knees out so your knees go out. That doesn't make any sense. If you hold a broomstick and you put some tape around it, it doesn't start magically twisting in the direction that you wrapped the tape around it. Why would your knees do that based on the direction that you're wrapping the wraps? I can tell you firsthand, I've probably wrapped more knees than anybody you know. And that's not to brag. It's just to say I've been doing this for a long time and I've wrapped a hell of a lot of knees. My PB at a competition is 157 knees, sets of knees wrapped. So I've done it a lot. And I only wrap one way. To me, wrapping to the right is like writing with my left hand. So I only wrap to the left. So on the lifters that I wrap knees for, including several all-time record squats, I wrap one knee out and one knee in. The reality is that it doesn't matter unless it matters. And the only times it really matters are two main things. One is just pure lifter preference. So some lifters have certain paranoia or superstition around the direction their knees are wrapped. The other is a little bit more real, which is if you have issues with your knees of various shapes and forms, wrapping a particular direction can really aggravate that. So for someone, for example, who has issues with like patella maltracking, the patella is kind of getting pulled laterally outwards. When you wrap outwards, it feels like a hot knife being stabbed in the patella tendon. It feels horrible. Those people tend to prefer their knees being wrapped inwards. And there can be other knee issues that cause people to prefer different styles or directions of knee wrap. But long story short, the direction you wrap your knees doesn't matter that much. In fact, it barely matters at all. The next thing that is a really common myth is like wrapping different ways to do stopping versus rebound. Let's just touch on how does a knee wrap work. Very, very, very simple. A knee wrap is an elastic material with a cotton outer, right? It stretches. When you stretch something, what does it want to do? Go back to its original shape. Just like the elastic that holds your underpants up. It's the same thing. So how you wrap, as in the style crisscrosses up and down, back and forth, whatever, doesn't change the principle of how the knee wrap works. It will change how it feels potentially. It will impact superstition to some degree. We've got a knee wrap tutorial on the ZeroW YouTube. You can just go to the ZeroW YouTube and type in how to wrap or wraps or something like that, and you'll see how I wrap. The two most important things when it comes to wrapping knees is that the spread of the wrap is even and the tension is consistent. So you want to have the spread of the wrap very even, starting just below the knee, ending just above the knee, or a little bit higher up the knee than what it goes below. Any further down than that gets really aggravating for the calves and feels horrible, and is kind of pointless as well. Much higher, you're probably just going to lose wrap by spreading it too thin. But you want the coverage to be even and the tension to be even. That's about it. So in terms of the style, the way that you wrap, crisscrosses up and down, very much personal preference. A lot of people ask why I ended up with the style that I wrap. So the style I wrap, I start at the top, I go 3 revolutions down, and then I do little crisscrosses on the way up. And people are like, "Oh, what's the function of that? What is that doing?" Honestly, it looks really good. Like when I'm finished with the wrap, it's like a piece of artwork. That's why I wrap that way. I like the way it looks. It's less about function at that point, making sure it ticks the principles of even and consistent, and it does its thing. So wrapping style, kind of irrelevant. Don't buy into stopping or spring power. Wraps are elastic. They are made to spring. That is their job. They're not made to stop you. And who is descending so fast that they need something to stop them at the bottom? It doesn't make sense. It's pretty common for people to talk about the speed of your descent when you're squatting in knee wraps, and the same could be said with sleeves to some degree. People will talk about squatting down faster. Let's not talk about wraps for a second. Just talk about another myth associated with descent speed. People will say descend fast to catch the stretch reflex. Anyone who says that automatically does not know what the stretch reflex is. So what the stretch reflex is that you've got muscles that act as antagonists to another muscle, right? You've got muscles working equal and opposite to each other, or working opposite to each other. If this is very simply put, I'm not a physiology professor or something, but like your tricep is going to act as an antagonist to your bicep. What the stretch reflex is it's in the bicep and the tricep to stop the other one from overriding the joint that it's acting upon, your elbow. So if my tricep could keep extending my elbow beyond what my bicep is capable of doing, it would just snap in half. Like it doesn't want to go that direction. So when the arm is flung like that, what happens, the bicep contracts to catch it, to stop it from continuing to travel and creating injury. That's the stretch reflex. So when I do that, it's not like my arm flings back violently and strongly. The stretch reflex is not powerful enough to move a 300 kilo squat. It's not doing shit. It's just stopping your quads from ripping off the bone. So it's not helping you lift weights. Don't buy into the stretch reflex conversation. So in terms of descent speed for squatting then relative to the wrap, that would suggest that if you go down fast, you'll catch the spring of the wrap. If you want to get really technical, Google a principle called Hooke's law, which talks about the notion of the fact that when you pull back on a spring, elastic would fall into this category. The distance of which that spring will then travel is relative to how far you pull it back, not how quick you pull it back. The time doesn't have anything to do with it. And so in saying that, that's why we wrap tighter, because the more it stretches, the more it wants to recoil. That's how the principle's working, not the speed at which you stretch it. And if that were the case, because there's, people will talk about kinetic energy and stored energy in muscles and 7 seconds, yada, all just technical nonsense that doesn't actually make sense, because the energy that they should be talking about is that which is stretched in the wraps. And that's going to be way longer than that magical 7 seconds. If you don't know what I'm talking about with the 7 second thing, don't worry, not important. It's just dumb things that people sometimes try to use to justify things where they're wrong about lifting. That sounds really mean, but it's true. All right. Another common myth with squatting and knee wraps is that your technique should change for some reason. The technique doesn't change. The squat is still a squat. The squat is primarily driven by the muscles of your legs and your hips. That still works the same. Your bracing still works the same. The upper back still works the same. The technique will not change. However, the reps may influence how a squat feels. Of course, it feels horrible around your knees, just like a fresh set of sleeves when you've never used stiff leaves before feels kind of funky. When you wrap your knees really tight, your knees don't want to bend forward. Like you automatically want to resist that. And so for lifters who squat in a monolift, for example, they'll bias towards all of a sudden standing wider because they're used to bending their knees as they get under the bar. So there will be some automatic technical changes that lifters make by accident that should really be corrected to what they're used to squatting with in terms of technique. People will talk about like using the wraps, driving your knees forward. If you have to go that deep into the weeds to completely change someone's squat based on the fact that they're wearing knee wraps, I think that speaks more to the fact that you've wrapped the person too aggressively too fast and they haven't learned the skill of the wrap yet, rather than, oh, that means you have to change technique for wraps, because it should never be that. A squat is a squat, and it's always going to be a squat, regardless of no sleeves, wraps, squat suit, multiplier, all the rest of it shouldn't change at all. The technique is still the same. It's a squat. So coming back to, I guess, what a knee wrap is and what it does, it's an assistive piece of equipment. So again, it's a piece of elastic that stretches, that wants to go back to its original shape, which helps you lift more weight. And it's important that you understand that, because it helps you then understand the nuance of building wraps into the training. It's funny, I present a coach development course, and in that course, we talk about the differences in equipment, and we split equipment broadly into assistive and supportive, where assistive is equipment specifically designed to help you lift more weight. Supportive is there to just act as a support. So for example, a belt is a supportive piece of equipment. The belt in and of itself doesn't help you lift more weight. It supports you in creating a brace. Having a good brace then helps you lift more weight. I used to say that knee sleeves fall under supportive, not assistive. They don't actually help you lift more weight. But the new age of sleeves, you could definitely argue, help you lift more weight. So neoprene is rubberized. Like neoprene is rubber material. Rubber has elastic quality. Rubber stretches and wants to go back. So the new age of sleeves, I'd definitely say, is semi-assistive, but nowhere near as assistive as a knee wrap. So knee wraps are assistive. That raises a few important points. The reason why you don't want to always train in knee wraps if you're a wrapped lifter is that an assistive piece of equipment is helping you lift more weight than you can lift without that piece of equipment. So it's allowing you to lift supramaximal weights. When you're lifting supramaximal weights, there's going to be an increased rate of fatigue. There's going to be an increased potential of injury, which is really not necessarily because of the wraps themselves, but more because of the load. You're just lifting more weight than you should be lifting, should in air quotes, of course. And so that needs to be factored in. So an important part where it would be factored in, when should you start wearing knee wraps? If your technique is such that you can't even do a proper squat without assistive equipment, loading the bar more and using assistive equipment is a bad idea. So a good example of this is kids. If you're putting kids in knee wraps and they haven't learned the skill of doing a technically sound squat at this point, adding more weight by adding knee wraps is a bad idea. That's when somebody is potentially going to get hurt. So knee wraps are an assistive piece of an equipment. But the interesting thing with assistive equipment is that it's not just there or not there. Just like it's like when people ask questions around what's the difference between someone who's natty and on performance enhancing drugs. Well, it's not just natty or not natty. Not natty has an entire spectrum. Like somebody having 1 or 200 milligrams of testosterone a week is going to have a very different experience to someone blasting with 500 milligrams of test and 100 milligrams of D-bol on training days and tren and all the rest of it. Wraps are very much the same in the sense that they're a scalable piece of equipment. It's not just wraps on or wraps off. And again, if you're a sleeve lifter, the easiest way to rationalize this is your SBD sleeves are going to feel very different to your Inza power sleeves, your rigor mortis sleeves. The SBDs aren't going to give you as much assistance, so you might use them for more voluminous training periods, and you might use your INSs for heavier training cycles. Same thing with reps. You can wrap them tight or loose. So intra wrap, there is already scalability. You can wrap them really tight, you can wrap them really loose, but also inter wrap, as in like there's different types of wraps. You can have a loose pair of wraps, a tight pair of wraps. A lot of the times wrap lifters will go through a cycle where it's like you have your comp wraps that you save for the last, your peaking weeks in your competition. As those wear out, they become your training wraps. You throw your training wraps out, donate them to the gym, whatever you do with them. Your comp wraps become your training wraps, get new comp wraps, and away you go through the cycle. So wraps are a scalable piece of equipment, which makes it important to understand how to scale that then into your program. So for example, and I don't want to go too deep into this because it's going to get too long, but for example, let's say you squat 350 kilos in reps, and your best sleeve squat is 295 kilos. So a pretty big disparity. 55 kilos off the 350, what's that? It's like 15, 20%. It's a decent difference between the two. When you go from a sleeve cycle into a wrap cycle, you're not just going to plug in the numbers and lift relative to where your wrapped max used to be, because that's going to jump you from, like, let's say 220 kilo training numbers at the end of the last block to like 260 training numbers at the start of the next block, when you haven't had that experience, that sort of like nice transfer between sleeve lifting and wrap lifting. So you can use wraps to scale your training to gradually build in that increase in load over time. And it's important to be mindful of that when you're either programming this yourself or programming for others, is understanding the nuance and the scalability of wraps as they apply to training, and knowing how to I guess, bring them in such a way that training doesn't get disrupted by sessions that are too heavy or sessions that are too light. Another couple of reasons why you wouldn't just train year round in knee wraps, they kind of suck. Like, if you're doing 3 sets of 8 in knee wraps, the carpet burn sensation that you're going to get is horrible. Overloading all the time, the weakness in your squat is probably not going to be your legs. It's probably going to be your bracing your upper back. And if you're always going heavy, you're going to run into consistent arm issues by lifting too heavy all the time. There's a lot to be said for building a good, strong base and then adding equipment to it. And again, if you're a lifter who uses performance-enhancing drugs, this is very similar to, you're not going to blast year round, right? You're going to have periods of time where you're taking less performance enhancing drugs and then introduce them closer to whatever your goal may be. Wraps are very much the same. You're going to feed them in slowly. You're not going to have them there year round. You're going to use lighter squats, lighter relative to your capacity with wraps, to refine, rebuild technique, to make sure that when you then go into super maximal weights, you're bulletproof. You're not going to have these catastrophic injuries that we see from time to time. So a couple of final points I want to touch on is, do wraps create a higher potential risk of injury in and of themselves? I hesitate to say no. So again, injury, if you want to break injury right down to bare bones, to the brass tacks, whatever you want to call it, if you want to break it right down, ultimately injury happens when tissues get overloaded. And so that can happen in numerous ways: technical breakdown, overall fatigue, creating overload in a particular area, or technical breakdown that leads to that overload. But overload in the sense of actual load on the bar is a real thing, and an assistive piece of equipment is going to allow you to lift more weight. So there's that piece of the puzzle. But from a more anecdotal standpoint, I tend to see a few more of those muscle tears in and around the muscles of the legs, like adductor tears. Hamstring tears are very rare in powerlifting in general, especially in squats. So are calf tears. But adductor, lateral hamstring sometimes, and some quad tears coincide with knee wraps more often than they coincide with knee sleeves. And there can be numerous factors that contribute to this. But one thing can be, in again, purely anecdotal, purely speculation, is that when you wrap a knee and everything's soft, it's going to pull tendons to the side and preload them, put pre-tension on them, and then we add more load to that with the bar and more stretch as you go through a movement. Potentially, there's risk of increased tension in that area, potentially risk of increased tear, but ultimately it's going to come down to load more than anything. But really, wraps in and of themselves, I wouldn't be scared of them from an injury perspective. The last point I wanted to make is, are wraps useful for sleeved lifters? There was a time where I'd say yes, and I actually used to program wrap squats for sleeve lifters, much the same as you would have used any form of overloading. So a slingshot, for example, slingshot bench to overload the movement, to work on position with heavier weights, to build confidence with heavier weights, a reverse banded squat or deadlift or bench press. You could use knee wraps as an overload for the squat for whatever reason that you might have the justification to do it. The reason why I would probably say don't waste your time these days is that it's another cost, it's another skill you have to learn, and honestly, it's probably not beneficial enough to override just sound training principles in general. It's not going to give you the edge. If there's a general interest and a general desire to have a wider skill set, especially if you're a coach, I think it's beneficial to understand the feeling of things, even if you don't do them. If you don't do sumo deadlifts, but you're a coach, people are going to want to do it. And being able to speak to feeling can be powerful. But by and large, there's probably not that much benefit for a sleeved lifter, exclusively sleeve lifter, to spend time squatting in knee wraps. Anyway, hope that helps. Thank you again, Sean, for the suggestion. If anyone else has suggestions on what you want to hear me talk about, I'm always open to it, always keen to chat. Enjoy.